that can result in the evolution of a population over time. The first of these processes is mutation, and mutation is a really important evolutionary process because it injects new genetic variants into a population. So what I have here is an example of a Drosophila mutation. If you have one mutation in the antennapodia gene in Drosophila, you end up with a fly that has antenna coming out of its head where its leg should be. And that's a really drastic example of a mutation, but it shows you how mutations can provide new genetic variants in a population. The second evolutionary process is migration. And this is when individuals move from one population to another. And when they move from one population to another, they're carrying their genes with them. And so they're changing the genetic makeup of both of those populations. The third evolutionary process is random genetic drift. And this is a process, a random process, by which the genetic variance is lost or shuffled around in a population. And usually when we think about random genetic drift, we think of a population bottleneck, where you randomly lose a large number of individuals from a population just randomly. And so you end up losing rare variants in that population. The last evolutionary process is natural selection. And this process generates variation in reproductive success and survival of different kinds of individuals. And I'm going to concentrate today on evolution by natural selection. And this process is distinct from the other three evolutionary processes, and that is the only evolutionary process that results in the adaptation of populations over time. And it's this adaptation that's responsible for much of the amazing phenotypic variation we see in natural populations. So, for example, a lot of adaptations you see are anti-predator adaptations. So, for example, you have frogs that are highly toxic, and they advertise this toxicity to predators by being very bright in coloration. You have leafy sea dragons, which are camouflaged in the seagrass to hide from predators. My favorite is this hawk moth caterpillar. And this is actually the hind end of the caterpillar. And when a predator approaches, it puffs up its hind end, which looks like a snake head, and it scares off the predator chasing it. You have adaptations such as parental care, intraspecific variation, interspecific variation. You can even get co-adaptations between two species, such as plants and their pollinators. So one of the major questions in evolutionary biology is, how does natural selection on phenotypic variation translate into the evolution of a population over time? That's not a serious slide. Okay, so natural selection works directly on phenotypic variation. So, for example, you have this hungry lion, and it approaches a herd of zebra, and it's most likely to catch and kill the slowest zebra in the group. So what that lion has acted to do is increase the average running speed in that surviving population of zebras. Okay, so that's natural selection, but that's not evolution. Evolution only occurs if there's heritable genetic variants for running speed in that population, so that when this herd of zebras goes on and reproduces and creates the next generation, they're passing on the genes for fast running speed that allowed them to survive in their environment. That's evolution. So natural selection works directly on phenotypic variation and indirectly on genetic variation to drive the evolution of populations over time. So how do we measure natural selection and predict how populations will evolve over time while taking into consideration phenotypic variation and genetic variation? So since the time when Darwin first published The Origin of Species in the 1850s until about the 1980s, we simply looked for selection acting in populations by looking if there was a change in the mean of a trait over time. So one of the best examples of natural selection measured in the wild was a study done by Peter and Rosemary Grant on Galapagos groundfinches. So the Grants would go to the Galapagos every year, and on one island, they would measure survival in a population of groundfinches over 1 year, as well as measure a bunch of different morphological traits. One of these traits was bill depth. During an extreme drought year, the seeds that these birds eat became extremely dry, and only birds with large, deep bills could crack and eat these seeds and survive. And so mortality selection over 1 year caused the average bill depth in the population to increase by 0.5 millimeter. And so that's a nice, clear example of direct selection on one trait. And until the 1980s, how we looked for this selection in natural populations was called the selection differential. You take the mean of the trait before selection minus the mean of the trait after selection, and that you say, okay, is there a difference? That's the selection differential. That's the strength of selection acting in a population. However, it's not always that simple. A lot of times you have phenotypic and genetic correlations between traits. So if you have a large bill size, you might also have a very large body size. Those two traits might be correlated. Or the genes underlying, the genes that code for body size might also code for bill size. And so you get these phenotypic and genetic correlations between traits that can cause apparent evolution in one trait that's actually due to direct selection on another trait with which it's correlated. And so how do we keep track of direct and indirect selection on multiple traits in concert? For this, we use the multivariate breeders equation. And I'm going to leave the multivariate breeders equation down here, but it's actually a really simple general equation that I'm going to explain pictorially. And this was originally developed by the breeders of domestic plants and animals to do things like increase crop yields. So say you're a farmer and you have, oh, let's see, it's beheaded my cow. So say you're a farmer and you have a bunch of dairy cows and you want to select to breed dairy cows with a higher milk yield. So you measure milk production in all of your dairy cows and you select only those with extremely high milk production to breed for the next generation. Okay, so that's the selection differential, the change before and after selection. But this doesn't take into account the phenotypic correlations between traits. So you selected for increased milk yield, but milk yield might be correlated with body size, so that you not only get cows that have increased milk yield, but you also have giant cows. So that takes into account the phenotypic variation, but how do we predict what the next generation of cows will look like? For this, we need to understand the underlying heritable genetic variance in these traits. If there is lots of additive genetic variance for milk production, but not for body size, what you'll end up in the next generation with is cows that have an increased milk yield compared to the parent generation, but normal body size. Whereas, by contrast, if you have lots of additive genetic variance for both body size and milk production, you'll end up in the next generation with big, high milk producing cows. And this is called the evolutionary response to selection. It's a change in the mean of the trait from the parent to the offspring generation. So one thing I want to point out about this equation before we move on is now that we understand the phenotypic correlations between traits, when we go out and actually measure selection in the field, we measure a selection gradient. And this gradient takes into account the phenotypic correlations between traits, and it gives us one number for each trait that we're measuring selection on that says, what is the direct selection acting on this trait? What is the intensity of selection and the form of selection acting on that trait? So today I'm going to talk about how natural selection results in the evolution of populations over time. First, I'm going to show you how we measure selection in the wild and how multivariate selection analyses can be used to address evolutionary questions. Second, I'm going to go into further depth on the importance of genetic variance in shaping the evolutionary response to selection over time. And then last, I'm going to talk about how we visualize complex fitness surfaces and how we compare these over time. So first, I'm going to talk about selection on phenotypic variation. So at the beginning of my PhD, the thing that really got me interested in evolutionary biology, as Charles said, is what maintains all this amazing